talk on terrorism. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Can you kindly introduce yourself and your title, please?
My name is Michael Stevens. I'm a researcher from the UK and I work for the Royal United Services Institute, and we focus on defense and security studies.
Welcome to the program. Here, sir, please.
I'm Pepe Escobar. I write for Asia Times. I'm editor-at-large, a foreign correspondent. We are based in Hong Kong.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and welcome to Baghdad once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Michael, please, as you well know, I believe, the international community was very supportive to Iraq in his battle against Daesh. Unfortunately, there was other side to the battle. There was so many displaced people and unfortunate casualties. Do you think the international community also will be supportive in such a case for the Iraqi government and the Iraqi people the same way it was supportive in the battle itself?
Well, I think that the West likes to, first of all, deal with a problem with military means if it can,
yes,
but there's always a development and a humanitarian dimension, and if you don't solve those problems, then all you do is create another issue which comes back at you in a few years down the line. So I think that what's happening now, certainly in the conversations that I've had in London and also with people in Washington, D.C. and in Europe, that there is an appetite to do more, particularly on working with displaced people, working with refugees. Of course, there are still refugees from Syria and Iraq, to try and get them back to their homes as quickly as possible, to provide reconstruction, development aid, and also facilities for the Iraqi government to extend education, to extend a better quality of life, and then to start tackling this issue of jobs, unemployment, youth without much to do. These are all things that need to happen, and they need to have a concerted effort over a number of years if people are to get the solution right. As I said, the issue is that there is always an appetite politically for dealing with a problem of Daesh with military means. We have to do it today, it's such a threat. But actually it's dealing with the long-term issues. The appetite is there, but it needs to be put into place, and the next few years will be crucial.
Absolutely. If we go back to the conference itself, the first conference in Iraq, for you personally, what's the sample of the conference in a country as Iraq fought aggressively against terrorism and Daesh with all cruelty? What does it mean for you also the exchange of experience and thoughts and ideas between representatives from all over the world and the Iraqi people?
In many parts of Asia, there is, I would say, absolute ignorance at the real role of Hashd al-Shaabi. The fact, for instance, that they are incorporated with the Ministry of Defense since a law passed last November. In the US, if you talk about this in Washington, maybe Michael, most people don't even know about it. So they think that this is a sort of Iranian-controlled illegal militia. And that's the perception in Washington, in London, in Paris, and I would say even in Brussels as well. Right. So this is very important in terms of showing how Hashd works, the fact that it's a pluralistic, multidisciplinarian sort of organization, yes, with the Christians, with Yazidis, with Sunnis, not only Shiites, that it's an absolutely legal organization, that this was in response of Ayatollah Sistani's fatwa in 2014. It's very, very important because it's a religious call, but it's also a political call, and it's a national unity call as well. So if we as foreign journalists have the opportunity to explain these details to Western audiences and Asian audiences as well, it's an enormous plus. And in my particular case, I came here to learn about how Hashd operates. In fact, I'm not here exactly to dictate anything from the West. On the contrary, to learn from your own experience.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Michael, for you on your personal level, you came to Iraq in this particular time, and we are hopefully almost done with Daesh. We're going to fight in Al-Qa'im and Rawa, and it will be the last battle.
Mosul in June 2014.
Yes, sir.
I was also near Sinjar in August 2014.
Okay.
So I remember very well what it looked like.
Yeah, before and after.
Exactly. To say, I mean, coming here now, over the 3 years since that's happened, it's remarkable the turnaround. And yes, I've come here to Baghdad at a time in which I think security is a lot better. Talk more about the political issues behind some of the issues which are happening. My view actually is that this conference has come at the right time. It's come at the right time for a number of reasons. One, I think the state institutions of Iraq are stronger than they've been for years. There's goodwill in the West behind the Prime Minister. People genuinely believe in the power of the Prime Minister to change things for the better. And I think that, you know, we need to have that conversation now about what happens after Daesh, and how we begin to think of policies to make sure that Daesh doesn't return in any way. Let's remember, Syria is still not stable. So your border country is still quite unstable. You've got instability now in the Gulf between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. You know, there are a lot of different things happening which will have an impact on Iraq's stability.
Absolutely.
So, and of course, as we know, Saudi Arabia and Iran are still have this tension among them. Iraq sits right in the middle of that. So we need to have a conversation right now about how Iraq manages to withstand some of those pressures from the region, but also how they get the counterterrorism strategy right, but also development and political reconciliation right. And I think it is great that, you know, ISIS are now limited to Al-Qaim and on the border regions, but it's not the end of the question. And I think what we need to do is begin to have that conversation, and that's what I think, you know, I came here to learn, to see how the Iraqi government is reacting, what strategies it's got in place, how it thinks about security, and how it thinks about the future for all of its citizens.
Mr. Michael just pointed out that his personal experience a couple of years back on Iraq, before and after. If we go back a little bit in our history and we see the international community reaction towards the situation the Iraqi people and the Iraqi government faced at the time, the international community unfortunately took the things very light, if you like. That's its personal issues, its Iraqi issues that has been attacked for so many justifications by the international community for the terrorism. Time reveals that the terrorism issue is not an Iraqi thing, it's not a Syrian thing, it's an international community unfortunate phenomenon. How the Western look today, in your personal point of view, today to terrorism as an international threat than 3-4 years back?
In the middle of the global war on terror, in fact, which metastasizes into different kinds of viruses, in fact. We had the different manifestations of the classic Al-Qaeda born in Peshawar virus. Then we had Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Yemen, the Zarqawi gang here, and then later ISIS, which was born inside, I would say, a sort of mini concentration camp, Camp Baka, where you had officials from Saddam, top officials, and minor and mid-level clerics that were Wahhabi infused. They got together and they had an organizational plan for something that would transcend what Al-Qaeda in Iraq was doing here. So it's a virus that metastasizes all the time. And the problem is, there are a lot of foreign players that profit from this state of affairs to interfere in internal affairs of sovereign nations. Case of Iraq, case of Syria especially. Now, it's very important because 3 of these players, okay, I'll give you just 3 examples.
Yes, sir.
Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar. Saudi Arabia, now they're trying to come up with, which is basically a very well-organized PR operation to try to influence public opinion, global public opinion, to say, now we're going to modernize Saudi Arabia, which is an absolutely intolerant form of Islam, which is Wahhabism. And MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, I prefer to call him MBS, he's trying to sell this idea to global public opinion. And the problem is, if they would fulfill this wish, they would have to go back to the mid-18th century in Saudi Arabia, when there was not Saudi Arabia. It was the lands of Arabia before the emergence of Wahhabism. And Wahhabism is something that public opinion in the West really don't understand, that Wahhabism is the ideological and operational matrix of all forms of Salafi jihadism. which is what we are facing in the West practically on a weekly basis, on the internet all the time, and what you in the Middle East are facing 24/7, in fact. So this actor, Saudi Arabia, now is trying to sell the idea that we are reforming ourselves, and that by implication, those fiery imams in Saudi Arabia are going to stop promoting Wahhabism around the world, which influences all forms of Salafi jihadism. We don't know. I see it as a pure PR operation. Turkey, they have other fish to fry at the moment. They are getting along well with the Russians and with the Iranians in the Astana negotiations, which is a very good prospect compared to, let's say, a year ago, when Turkey and Russia were completely antagonized and practically on the verge of a war. And Qatar, it was an even bigger turnaround because they financed, weaponized, funded jihadis here for the first 3 or 4 years, here and in Syria, when Daesh emerged from the shadows, let's put it this way. And in this fantastic turnaround, now they are getting closer relations with Iran. They are looking long-term to maybe even start exploring North Dome and South Pars, the gas oil fields, in tandem, and eventually have their best customers in Europe instead. When we think that, up to a year ago, there were different pipeline projects, one favoring Iran and Iraq, and another one favoring Qatar. So they have reorganized their alliances, Turkey and Qatar especially, and Saudi Arabia is more or less sidelined because they have succession problems, they have internal dissent that they cannot control, and they have a very bad image all over the world, not only the developed world, but also in the global south as well. So these could be elements that would give us maybe a possible roadmap in the future that Salafi jihadism is going to be relatively crushed. But it's a wait and see proposition.
Absolutely, absolutely. We hope for the best for everyone. Hopefully the people, the politics side of it will change their approach to deliver their message. Hopefully for the best of everyone, because extremism get us nowhere, and that's timely approved. Always get us nowhere. Let's, if we can't, our dear friend here, focusing very much on the region. Extremism, it's in the Middle East region. If we take it a little bit further, and we see it's very much a phenomenon. Point of view, what do you think the international community have to fight? Is it the ideology itself? Is it we have to fight the source, the finance, or the military side only? Or what exactly the approach fighting terrorism?
I think it differs depending on which country you're talking about. In the UK, I mean, we've had a number of attacks this year.
Correct, unfortunately.
And we used to look at the French and say, well, the French have a unique problem for them. They
Correct.
can't integrate their North African population.
Correct.
The way that their state is multicultural is not as good as ours. The Anglo-Saxon method is way better.
Is better.
Well, guess what? We learned some lessons this year. It's quite clear that there are serious problems. 2 of the attacks were very close to where I was. I work in Westminster, near Westminster Bridge, so I was locked in my office. And then the Parsons Green train, I live 1 stop from Parsons Green, and I was on 2 trains behind it. So,
unfortunate tragedy.
well, I mean, sometimes I'm safer here than I am in my own house.
That's good news. That's good. Very optimistic.
But what I'm trying to say is
Yes,
that this is clearly a problem that each individual country has to look at its own political components.
Correct.
We definitely have had to change our conversation. We in my institute are beginning to investigate those different types of sort of the disenfranchisement of people in our country. Why is it that they're attracted to this ideology? It's not like Britain is struggling financially. We're not doing as well as we were, but this isn't an issue of unemployment. It's not an issue of mass discrimination. It's not a situation, I think, where we fully understand the nature of the threat, but it's quite clearly linked to Daesh propaganda. So there's been a huge amount of activity from Western governments to coordinate about shutting Daesh away from the internet, getting them off Twitter, getting them off social media, getting them off the dark web. That's a huge area where international countries can come together.
Yes.
Because actually the internet is kind of everywhere,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And if there is one country which isn't doing its bit, then that propaganda is getting out, and then it's shared. It's shared in internet forums, it's shared across the world. So that's one issue. Counter-terrorist finance is something that we're working particularly with the Gulf states.
Yes.
They need to do more, but I think this problem between Qatar and Saudi Arabia has highlighted in the Gulf states
Yes.
this issue of counterterrorism financing. They're all promising to do more.
Yes.
Let's see. Let's see if they do. Because at the end of the day, you know, it is the case that in the West we have relationships with the Gulf.
Yes, sir.
We need them to do more. If they do more, that's great and everybody benefits, including Iraq, including Syria. But that's a conversation that needs to happen. The other conversation we need to have is this notion of why people don't feel British, why don't they feel French, why don't they feel, I don't know, Iraqi? Why is something, a transnational movement, more appealing to them than their own nation, which they grew up in, which they have, you know, friends in? They went to school with people, you know.
Correct.
Why have they gone some way and not the other way? And I think we've been struggling with this for decades now, and we'll see what happens. But I think you hit on a good point, which is that if this is not done internationally, then it creates more problems.
Absolutely. I will be right back. Stay with us, please. We'll talk about terrorism once again. If we take it, as we just said, if we take it as an international perspective of the terrorism, Iraqi government doing their best to fight terrorism. When they do any action, most of the time, international community criticize them for certain small, minor mistakes, if you can call. And obviously, it's, if you like to call it, it's open war. Our government, our people, doing their best to minimize their mistakes. As I record, the British Prime Minister, she announced that if fighting terrorism comes across human rights, she will put the human rights aside and she will keep fighting terrorism. Why do you think the international community, some of them obviously, when the Iraq government do any steps, most of the voices will go up very loud to defend the terror side of it?
Because we can say that nowadays there are two opposing camps, which is, I would say, the Atlanticist camp that wants to preserve the status quo where the West rules over most of the planet, in fact, and the other camp which is prone towards a more multilateral international relations approach. Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, the BRICS countries, of course, the 5 BRICS, what the Chinese call the BRICS Plus, which is expanding the BRICS to other global South nations. And in the middle of this conflict, which is Atlanticists against multilateralists, let's put it this way, we find something that we can define as the axis of resistance. I don't use this term, but there is an actual, real coalition nowadays that was tested in the fight against Daesh, which is the 4+1 mechanism. Russia, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Hezbollah. There's an enormous problem because for, I would say, many of the elites in the Atlanticist camp, some of these actors are considered terrorists. So then we will have to engage into a very serious conceptual debate what it means to be a terrorist. So can you compare, for instance, the Revolutionary Guards in Iran with Al-Qaeda? You cannot. But this is a long debate that we don't find anywhere, especially in Western mainstream media. So if we have a big actor like Russia coordinating this front, let's put it this way, which includes Iran, Iraq, and Syria, the fact that Russia is demonized, especially in Washington, and Michael is very much aware of it, the way everything Russian, and not only Putin, is demonized as the source of all evils nowadays, which is absolutely absurd. When you go to Russia, when you talk to the foreign minister in Russia, which is one of the most professionals on the planet, and you see what they're doing, and you understand their agenda and their long-term planning. and what is discussed inside the BRICS, for instance, especially about Russia and China, and how this Russia-China strategic partnership has evolved, especially these past 2 years. They are absolutely against any forms of terrorism, which are, like I said before, they are all Salafi jihadists. And we know very well where does it come from.
Correct.
Certainly it does not come from Syria, it does not come from Iraq, and it does not come from Iran. So the problem is, I see it as an informational war, in fact, between a Western camp that is hegemonic in many ways, and a mix of emerging big powers and the global south, which want to change the status quo. And terrorism is right in the middle of, I would say, the crux of this ideological debate. So it's absolutely impossible to have a serious conceptual debate about the origins of terrorism if you don't implicate Saudi Arabia directly. I remember the jihad in Afghanistan in the 80s, which was, unfortunately, I couldn't cover on the spot because I was in Europe. But I was focused all the time during the jihad on, okay, so we have the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan using an armada of jihadists, multicultural jihadists from all over the Muslim world to fight a government in Afghanistan, the intersection of Central Asia and South Asia, and they never thought that this could, the blowback would be tremendous, as it was.
Absolutely.
So when you have Reagan talking about the freedom fighters in Afghanistan as the moral equivalent of the founding fathers and all that stupidity, obviously nobody in the White House or in the State Department or the Pentagon or the CIA were thinking about, okay, these guys are going to turn against us when it's finished in Afghanistan, which is exactly what happened. And that was the embryo of Al-Qaeda. So we have to go back to policies by the hegemonic powers in the West that helped to create Salafi, helped to enhance Salafi jihadism all over the world. So if we don't have this debate in depth, in Washington, in London, in Paris, and in Brussels, for instance, nothing will be accomplished in terms of the war on, the real war on terror, which is something that you experienced here in Iraq for the past 14 years, I would say.
Mr. Michael? To summarize it, I think it's international affairs. It's not Iraq fighting terrorism. It's an international issues, international battle. Do you agree with the opinion of states' conflict of interest? Any states, so many states involved, so many parties involved. All these fights, all these battles behind the doors, closed doors. Iraq is the backyard of, I don't know, paying the final bill, if you like. Unfortunate situation for us is so many parties, all of them sitting in Iraq and fighting. It's not Iraq facing terrorism only, it's bigger and wider image out there.
What I would say to that is the difference between where Iraq sits in terms of its regional environment and, say, France, which is suffering from some serious problems with radicalization, is very different. You don't have, for example, Germany and Spain interfering, or at least maybe through the EU, depending on how you see the EU. But you don't have, security organizations interfering, or, we talk about Russia, but Russia is actually interfering in European politics, and I think that's probably where we disagree. I think, as a British person, we do see the Russians as very negative in terms of the way that they work in our politics. But ultimately, this is the difference. Nobody calls the integrity of France into account. I know Spain is having this issue with Catalonia, but Spain is not expected to collapse. France is not expected to collapse. Iraq has a problem of its regional partners, Iran, Turkey, instability in Syria, the Saudis, of course, and then a layer of international interests as well. And let's be honest, Iraq is not the strongest state. You can say what you like about Saddam.
We're going there, hopefully. We're going there.
But he had a strong state apparatus, which the Americans came in and trashed, and actually we as the British kind of did that as well. And we didn't put something in place which was strong and was able to resist some of the external interference that's going on. And there is external interference. Let's be honest. The Turks have a base in Bashika.
Correct. Military base.
Our military bases in Britain that are American are because we're NATO allies.
Correct.
Iraq and Turkey are not part of a military alliance. It is a direct interference of one country in another one's affairs. You then have the relationship that Iran has with certain parties here, with the Saudis have certain parties, the Qataris were funding certain groups. So it's going to be much more difficult for Iraq to find its balance, right? Because of all of these different issues. And then on top of that, you have a phone call from the White House. And then you have a different phone call with Jim Mattis in the Pentagon, and you have a different phone call with Secretary Tillerson.
Yeah.
So what is
So many
American
sides
policy?
in it,
Who
yeah.
knows?
Okay.
And American policy with regards to some of the regional actors is not clear either. So how you then stabilize the country is very, very difficult. I would say there is an international consensus around terrorism, particularly around Salafi jihadism. Everybody is affected by Salafi jihadism. I mean, some of the countries we need to talk about here are Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan,
Correct.
Tajikistan. Half of these people found their way into northern Iraq and into Syria.
Correct.
We need to have a conversation with those countries. We need to have a conversation with countries in Southeast Asia, where they face some terrible issues with radicalization. The issues in Myanmar with the Rohingya, these drive problems across the region. So it's not just isolated to the Iraqi issue. But Iraq is very heavily affected by it because of its neighborhood. And that's a conversation which is not unique to Iraq, but it's much more difficult to solve.
You agree or disagree with the opinion that stated that all the western side of the world and so many other countries, unfortunately, they throw their terrorists and terrorism personnel into Iraq, into the Middle East and Iraq, observing all this terrorism, attracting them, so they won't get the headache of the explosions and bombs in Europe. So apparently they allow them in a way, somehow, to get into Iraq, directly or indirectly.
They don't try hard enough to suppress it.
You believe that?
I'm still puzzled, like many observers are, at what happened in June 2014 when you have a convoy of 500 gleaming white Toyotas crossing the Syrian deserts to the Iraqi desert, all the way to Mosul a few days later.
Invisible.
The Americans have satellites tracking this region 24/7. They can identify license plates anywhere in any traffic jam. How come? So when Michael Flynn, when was that? 3 years ago, when Michael Flynn went on Al Jazeera, and he admitted on the record it was a willful decision taken in Washington to let Daesh fester in Syria, Iraq. This is an enormous bombshell. It doesn't prove, of course, direct collusion of the US government, but it proves that certain factions of the US deep state certainly knew exactly what was going on. Okay, let it happen, because this is going to be helpful for us against to impose regime change in Syria. So this is completely crazy. This is direct interference by a hyperpower in a situation that for Syria and for Iraq was an absolute disaster. And it took 3 years to get rid of Daesh after that. You remember very well, on a daily basis. It's not like in Europe where I live in France part-time as well. And every few weeks we have a Daesh-inspired mini attack somewhere in France. So your problem is extremely serious. Like in Europe, we have, I would say, echoes of the huge fights that Syria and Iraq has to deal with it 24/7. And it's ultimately because of these two factors. Spread of Salafi jihadism, which the ideological matrix that I referred before, Saudi Arabia, and the fact that big powers are interfering all over the spectrum.
I mean, can I come in on that? Because
please.
In my experience, one of the biggest problems of what happened in 2014 was that the West didn't really want to see it. So I remember very, very clearly having conversations at the end of 2013 with officials saying, listen, the problem isn't just Syria, it's Iraq. If you look at the death count towards the end of 2013, it was spiking. Correct. You had problems in Fallujah, you had problems across Anbar, and at that time, nobody wanted to hear. Why did no one hear? Because they were so focused on Syria. Correct. And at the time, remember the thing we all talked about was Jabhat al-Nusra.
Yeah,
for us,
correct.
Daesh was just some crazy guys with some vehicles that were driving around. Nobody really thought that they could do this. all of the attention at that time was about, Assad using chemical weapons, and then how do we get rid of Assad? How do we fight Jabhat al-Nusra? That nobody saw the link to Iraq. And this is the thing, Daesh was 6 months ahead of every single body, like they were ahead of the Iraqi state, they were ahead of the Syrian state, they were ahead of the West. And one of the things I always say when I come to this region, which is often, is that for once, you need to accept that actually the West just didn't get this right at all. Misread the threat, misread the seriousness of the threat, didn't want to see it. Bear in mind, at that time, Obama, in his mind, was still, I want to get out of Iraq. I'm not interested in Iraq anymore. I'm interested in all the other things. And it left a massive vacuum. And I think, if I'm honest, where I would put some blame on the US administration was their lack of wanting to listen. They just didn't want to listen. I don't think it was actually a willful creation of Daesh or any of this stuff. It was that they just weren't interested. Iraq, that problem's finished. We're done with it. The issue right now is Syria, and the issue is, Egypt and Mohammed Morsi being overthrown and all this stuff. And yet, actually, when we look at it, anybody could have told you in 2013 that Mosul was full of Al-Qaeda. Didn't know it was Daesh, but it was Al-Qaeda. And everybody, I remember, we used to drive near to Mosul, and people would say, don't go in there, you're a Westerner, it's full of terrorists, they'll kill you. And yet nobody connected Mosul to Raqqa and to Manbij and all these areas and said, hang on, there's something going on. So for me, 3.5 years later, it's a really expensive mistake. Massive.
Absolutely. We lost a lot of life, we lost a lot of resources.
The Obama administration should take some blame for this.
Correct.
They weren't interested when they should have been.
I'll just follow up on this point you have just raised. If we follow up on the Western side of it, unfortunately, when we talk about terrorism, most of the time we go back to the Middle East, Syria and Iraq pop up, first line.
Sure.
If we talk about terrorism in Europe side of it, and let's take Britain, for example. Do you think the government there are doing enough, or always when they do something, whatever step they take, and always there is, as you very well know, human rights issue stand against their movement and against them trying to do their best to fight terrorism on their side of the world? Because obviously, unfortunately, they're moving all over the world, as you know.
Sure. So I know what you were referring to earlier in the interview. Theresa May made a speech on the campaign trail.
Yes.
Where she said that human rights were not a big issue. Actually, that was quite unpopular. And what she was doing was making a speech at a time in which we'd had 3 attacks in quick succession.
Correct.
Honestly, during a campaign, it plays to play the hardline card.
Correct.
Look how well she did in the elections. Okay, she didn't do well.
Correct. Lost majority.
And she's now clinging on, with dear life. I saw her giving a speech the other day where she was talking about this issue, and I sort of feel like she's come back to a more sensible position. She's not in the campaign mode anymore. She is trying to show a bit of leadership again. She did talk about the need to engage with the Gulf states. She did talk about the need to look at terrorism in our own country in a little bit more of a balanced way. At the end of the day, one of the things about being, democracy is that the human rights issue in your own country in terms of how you treat people is really important, particularly when people are angry. And this is the thing, is that I can tell you as a British person, people started to get very angry about this issue. And there were revenge attacks on mosques by the extreme right wing. Correct. One of our biggest threats right now is the extreme right wing reacting to this perception that Muslims are taking over or whatever. So we've actually got different components of society clashing with one another. And ultimately, the government has to be aware that it must keep a set of laws and procedures in place which don't show favoritism, which aren't making the situation worse. My view is that it's extremely delicate. There's a lot more work to do, and I think now people are starting to realize just how big the challenge is.
If we talk about the Iraqi situation, and we go back to Iraqi's Popular Mobilization Unit, as you well know, this mobilization, this unit, this young man, they absolutely respond to their clerk. Obviously, to defend their country, defend their honor, to defend their history and present and future. Why we always sense there are kind of a criticism from the Western media toward this movement, this group of people, even though they are obviously officially under the supervision of our commander-in-chief.
It's a mix of misinformation and ignorance, in fact. So it's something that's in my travels in the global south.
Yes, sir.
I'm always talking about, why don't you set up a PR operation in English? Then you're going to get feedback from all over the world in real time. This applies to everyone: Iraq, Iran, Somalia, countries in Southeast Asia. Nowadays it's an info war. Who is the ablest party to send the message out instantly and conceptualized, detailed photos, etc., social media, etc., then you start winning the information battle. And for instance, why Saudi Arabia is so, I have always to come back to the same
always go back to Saudi
why are
Arabia.
they so all over the airwaves and front page of newspapers all over the world? Because they have a very sophisticated PR operation based in DC, by the way, that spreads their message. So they are listened to and examined in English all over the world. This doesn't happen with Iran, Iraq, and Syria, for instance. Sometimes they have excellent points on, determined issues, but nobody knows what's going on. And Hashd al-Shabi, for instance, is a clear-cut case of nobody in the West, even among the elites and apart from the intelligence community, very few people know what the Hashd al-Shabi were doing.
What you will taken out from Iraq to your country on a personal level, on professional level?
Well, I mean, I think both Pepe and I have been here a number of times. And I think as people that care about the region, what we want to see is a better future for Iraqis, more stability. And people always ask, what do you mean by stability? First of all, safety. Iraqis should be able to go to the shops, buy some milk and come home without feeling like somebody's going to kill them, right? And be able to hope that actually their child can go to school, have a better life, and that they can hope for something better for their child. And I think that, this is the basic need that every human being needs to have. And actually one of the things that you have to communicate when you go back to the West, when they say, oh, what's Iraq like? I said, well, it's full of human beings. It's full of people that want the same thing that you do. They're just in a much tougher environment.
Absolutely. We want the truth, nothing but the truth.
So actually when you communicate a human story,
yes,
and I've had this before when I've written about human stories in Iraq, people go, oh my God, I didn't realize Iraqis were like this. Well, of course, they're human beings. They have 10 fingers and toes, right? They're not different from anybody, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you break through that kind of barrier, people start to see Iraq in a much more human way, and you start to be able to have a decent conversation about the things that you're experiencing and relate it back to some of the things that we go through. So being here just reinforces that sense that this is full of good people trying to live their lives and trying to get on with it, and that hopefully, it was, I referred to this when I was giving a talk in the conference, that we just have to have this dialogue. We have to keep talking. We have to have more of these events. There has to be more contact points.
Yes, sir.
Pepe referred to the way that Saudi Arabia does things. Saudi's good at having these conferences now.
Correct.
Yes, absolutely.
People come to Riyadh, they get visas, it's easy to come. Let's increase that. And then maybe we have a better chance of speaking a common language.
Hopefully the future will be bright for all of us.
Sure.
Yes, sir?
Coming here since my first trip to Iraq was in the late 90s. So I was here during Saddam. A few months when Iraq was already part of the axis of evil, I came here, I spent over a month, and we shot a 3-part documentary. It was an extended reportage all over.
All right.
And this was in the spring of 2002. I was here before shock and awe, during shock and awe, after shock and awe. I saw the first Sunni Shiite protest, in fact, against the occupation 9 days after shock and awe. So I was expecting this would take a while. It sprang up almost immediately. And it started in Kadimia, by the way. It started in Kadimia Shrine, and it went all over for 5 hours, and it was Sunnis and Shiites side by side with the Iraqi flag. So this was an extremely powerful moment where you could see that, well, if the Americans know exactly what they're doing, and we already knew that those neocons knew nothing about Iraq. We followed what Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz were discussing. We're going to be the new OPEC. This is going to pay for the occupation. We're not going to spend anything. It's going to be the new Middle East. We're going to install a democracy in a few months. And then we got Paul Bremer, and we all know what happened afterwards, right? So after all that, and coming here later during the surge, the beginning of the surge in 2007, for instance, where I was talking this with friends here. We were at a fish dinner by the Tigris the other day, watching the refinery in Dora on the other side of the river. 10 years ago, the whole neighborhood was taken over by Al-Qaeda. You could not even go there. They had expelled whole families, and they controlled the neighborhood, and they could spread out the rest of Baghdad if there was not some sort of counteroffensive, which there was. And then the Anbar awakening and all that. So when I compare, it's vivid in our minds, for instance, when you see the suffering of the Iraqi people for the past 14 years.
Very high price we paid for it.
It's a very high price to pay on your everyday life to have a stable, normalized country where, just as Michael said, you can go to the grocery and you're not going to get blown up like in Sadr. You remember when there were practically every week there was a suicide bomber or a car bomb in Sadr City, for instance. 2 million people living there. You know. So when you see there is Patrick Coburn, good friend of mine, we were discussing this yesterday. He said, yeah, he's slightly less pessimistic than it was. So we can see this as a new beginning for Iraq in terms of a unified country, stable, secure, of course, but it's just the beginning. And I hope in a Casablanca sort of is the start of a wonderful friendship between Iraqis among themselves, as a unified nation.
Absolutely. Let's hope for the best. Hopefully the future will be better for Iraq and better for everyone. Gentlemen, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Wish to see you soon in Baghdad in better situation. Hopefully to the best for everyone. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. See you next time. Thank you.